Thanks, Anjali. Okay. All right, so here we are. Welcome to the conversation. Let's start by going back to the share screen, and I'd like to have us look at the slide that is the basically the tile for today's talk. And it shows the Statue of Liberty asking the question, hey, can we talk about what I stand for? And I'd like us to think about these words that I switched them to, freedom and equity. And I'd like to each of us just to think about what do these words mean to us when you hear the word freedom, when you hear the word equity. I think equity for me has also become a more current time word that I think about. But what do they mean to you? And how would you finish the sentence with freedom and equity for ... But just take another moment. What is that? How do you think about those words? How would you fill in that phrase? And then take a moment and think about how does your answer depend upon the position you have in our country? Whether we call it privilege, the result of white supremacy and colonialism, or that we all have a unique experience that requires learning versus making assumptions. And how do you feel you fit into the fabric of this country, of these United States of America? All right, so I'm just going to stop screen sharing. If anybody has any thoughts that already have popped up into the mind, I'd be curious.
Yeah, the thoughts. Hi, Anjali here.
Yay, hi, Anjali.
Sorry that my video is off. Baby is right here, so.
No problem.
It's supposed to be freedom and equity for all. So that wasn't the first thing that popped into my head, but you know, as a woman and a person of color, that's not really the lens that my life has been viewed from, you know? And I think that, you know, you have to work harder for the opportunities, the same opportunities that white America seems to have. And just moving through the various, you know, decades of my life, I would say that that's been a struggle. So the thing that we should be talking about is how can we really make everything equal for all in our society. That's what popped into my head.
Absolutely. It seems that was maybe the intention, right, of that being written, but it's clearly not, not something that we're practicing as an entire country.
No.
It seems like there's a lot of natural tendency to want to polarize and assert power over one another. And as you know, I know I've been having conversations with some of you separately about this idea of how much of this is in our DNA, in our human nature to want to have power over someone else. And whether we feel that it's actual dominance through physical means, mental, emotional, but there's something built into us that's not something that just happened here in the US, but has been happening, maybe if we go all the way back to the beginning of time, where somebody with more power asserted that over someone who had less power or perceived less power. And that shows up in all kinds of ways in our culture, from color of skin, to looks, to size, to gender, to, you know, all of those kind of things. We could go down the list. And I heard recently, I'll just set this one last comment to go with what you're saying, is if somebody spoke about, rather than having power over, what if we had power with each other? And how can we create it so that we all have power with one another rather than a dynamic where there's constantly this overpowering.
Yeah.
What would that look like? Anybody else want to offer some initial thoughts as we get started from that first paragraph that Steve read, or any thoughts?
Well, it certainly seems like this country is at a tipping point. Well, we're certainly coming very quickly to a tipping point.
Yeah.
And you know, and when you first put this out to me about this gathering, I was thinking back in my lifetime. The only thing I could kind of compare it to was the Vietnam War protests, and that, as far as I can tell, that's the last time the American public raised up and rallied against the government and actually won. But what it really feels more like is, as this country was facing the Civil War, you know, and over slavery, that there was these huge divides and completely polarized in their thinking. And it's hard to see how this gets resolved without some major upheaval. I don't want to say another civil war, but in essence, I think that's where we're headed. Hopefully not as violent and as bloody as the first one, but it's not going to be pretty. That's for sure. I mean, this country was founded on capitalism, and the prevailing message of capitalism is the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And that's what we've kind of done as a country over the time that we've been in existence.
Yeah, that's where we've had some success for sure. But then it's been at the expense.
Well, it's been at the expense of
those who built the country.
The people of color and the indigenous communities, and just all the ones that can be taken advantage of and kept in their place.
Yeah. I just noticed your t-shirt.
Yes, vote no evil.
That was appropriate for today with the Statue of Liberty and being a monkey. Yeah, thank you. Go ahead, Regina.
So I think, I mean, a couple things that come to my mind is I think, you know, one is, you know, where do I feel like I don't have freedoms, right? And so where I don't feel like I have freedoms, that's something that needs to be changed. And who else, if I'm in that place, who else might be in that place? And then, you know, my background, at least for the last 14 years, has been working within city government in San Francisco. So I look at so much now of how I view things and look at things is through the political structure and the effects of that. And so therefore, I have a responsibility in how I participate in that how I participate in that political structure to ensure equity for, you know, what this country's, you know, its founding words are, but, you know, for the people that live here, for everybody that lives here. And so I'll just, you know, I'll leave it at that, but that is definitely a responsibility. And I guess I, you know, want to say one other thing is that, you know, and Mark, you and I had this conversation that as a white person in this environment, just because I might have progressive ideas, I mean, see myself, and I don't necessarily like to phrase myself as a progressive because I have a whole other loaded component added to that. But just because I see myself as, you know, a person who really, equity is very important, I still have to own, as a white person, the white culture, you know, economically, repressively, like I have to own that. Because if I don't own it, then it gives an out to all other white people who can, easily blindly go throughout their day without feeling responsible.
Yeah, I think that's key. And I appreciate you sharing that. I think clearly these last few years have been, for me, more of a wake-up call to understand the lack of equity in our world and the lack of conversation around this between groups. And there continues to be this polarizing, whether it's because of our leaders, whether it's because of our communities that have, what I'm learning more about now is this ongoing trauma of not knowing how to engage with one another because the healing hasn't happened, or the branch hasn't been extended in a way that actually feels transformative. It either feels that it's condescending, or it feels that it's creating some kind of a diminished relationship instead of an empowered relationship. And that's why I keep coming back to that. How can we power with, rather than, oh, I'm going to help you down there. It's like, oh, let's actually find this level field so that actually becomes the point of conversation. And it's so not level. It's somebody, I saw a woman explain it in this way. She said, imagine a Monopoly board and you start playing, but before you start to make any advancement, all of the houses are taken away from you to be able to buy. Or you get to the place that says, oh, you get to collect $200 and they actually only give you $1. And that just keeps being the case as you go round and round this board. How are you ever going to catch up? It's already set up for failure for a lot of people, for a lot of non-white people, And so where can we find, how do we find a little more of that balance or create power with one another? Anybody else have any thoughts at the moment that are coming to mind? I'll read another section. So I wanted to share a little bit more about this idea of the learning, unlearning, and relearning. And when we can learn where we have been ignorant, and maybe that's a harsh word to hear that. I'm not ignorant, but we can potentially think about, where is there places in our life that we just don't know. We don't have someone else's lived experience. We have not been in someone else's shoes. And we might make assumptions like, well, why can't they just do this? Well, why don't they just do that? And all that kind of putting it out there on others to figure it out when we don't understand what actually has happened, either historically to fully understand why someone might not be able to stand up tall and speak out. So that's the kind of ignorance I'm talking about, where we're unaware or we're even stuck in habituated ways of seeing the world. And then when we can unlearn those habits, unlearn those behaviors, unlearn the way that we were even taught to see the world, and then we can relearn with awareness and have today and move forward from here with a more educated, thoughtful place. I think we stand a better chance at being agents of change and support for one another. And we can move away from that inertia and the heavy hand of tradition for tradition's sake. I think sometimes that's what happens. It's like, oh my God, there's so much, I don't even know what to do. And so we just kind of do nothing, which falls us back into habit mode. And there's a comfort in that, even if it's a painful place. I often think of this as a parallel. It's like, thinking about somebody who's in an abusive relationship. And then I'm like, why wouldn't they leave? It seems, clear that they're in an abusive relationship. But then you hear of this person staying because at least they know that abuse. Versus if they were to break away from that, who knows what's out there? It's scarier. So they'd rather be with the known than the potential of the unknown. When we can have this light go on and we can basically move away from a life we learn more and more is filled with insanity, we come to understand how we got here and what choices are now available with this new insight. And then if we can take action from that place and have an epiphany of well-being, that's really for everyone. So that's my hope, is that think of some different things you've been through in your life when once you get the full information or once you understand the full story, it helps you move forward with a different perspective or a different action. But you wouldn't have known that had you not filled in the blanks to that story you didn't know, completely. And I know that was the case for myself, with like history books, education, growing up in Cincinnati, Ohio, having a certain perspective of what was reality. And then, learning by traveling and seeing different parts of the world and living here in San Francisco for so long. It's like a different access to information and sensitivity as a human being. So I want to go back to the slides and we'll just sort of look at the next one. And I'll have if someone else would like to volunteer to read this next one. Let's see here. And if we're here in this space, it's a little covered up on the screen. Whoops. Okay. Can somebody at home, somebody else was going to read, I think. Did I see a hand?
I can read it.
Okay, go ahead, Natasha.
National Museum of African American History and Culture. Fueled by the Enlightenment ideas of natural rights on man, spurred by the passion for religious freedom in search of property and escaping persecution, European colonists came to North America in search of a place to create a new society. The ideals of enlightenment spread to the North American colonies and formed the basis of their democracy as well as the most brutal kind of servitude, chattel slavery.
There's a second part. You want to read the second part?
Yeah, someone else can read the second part.
Okay. Somebody else want to read the second part?
In the world before 1500, the notion of hierarchy was a common principle. Every person belonged to a hierarchical structure in some way. Children to parents, parishioners to churches, laborers to landowners, etc. As the ideas of the natural rights of man became more prevalent through the 18th century, the concept of equality became a standard of stream of thought. By categorizing humans by race, a new hierarchy was invented because based on what many considered science.
Okay, thank you for reading those, Natasha. And Rachel, Anjali, any thoughts coming to mind by anyone here or anyone at home?
Well, not much has changed.
I know.
If you think about it,
Yeah.
it's just a different form of how we keep people in place. And now we control them financially.
Do not throw water on mommy. And do not blow out the candle.
Yeah, I mean, definitely through our land use and financial policies. I think one thing I wanted just to sort of mention is you're kind of to us, you said, how do you experience yourself as an American citizen? And I don't consider myself an American citizen. I consider myself a United Statesman. Because Canada's America, Mexico's America, every country in South America, they're all Americans, just like we are. And so that's very much a colonist sort of perspective. And of course, Europeans identify us as Americans, right? They look at us. And so I mean, this is sort of speaking to the here and now as our country, but so I like to not refer to myself as an American, unless I am saying I'm talking about all of, the citizens of the Americas. So I'm just gonna sort of put that out because I think even just that little thing sort of is an unconscious attitude that we should be the dominant country of all the Americas, and we have a lot of foreign policies that then still perpetuate financial and racial inequities in relationship to that perspective. So I just wanted to sort of put that out there.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think that's something I've become more aware of too, is how important language is and how we're kind of developing, in many ways, language that can support the advancement of thought and consciousness. We can ask ourselves, has the word, race and racism been a helpful word? Like in that last slide, this was a word that was created to help us. On one level, was it to identify, or was it to create a hierarchy, where white was at the top and everything else, There was a woman who, I read an article that she said, the word people of color or women of color, that came about in the mid to late 70s. And it was a way for women of color chose that to be able to identify as a community for strength, rather than a term that was put on them by someone else. But even the idea of using the word color differentiates from white. And so is it, someone else I read about said, this is also allowing a dominant force to determine what happens below it, differentiating words. So I think there's a way that words help us advance, but I think also language can be slow to catch up with fully understanding how fast we are moving as humans and how fast the shift in consciousness is happening. But we need some way to help direct us forward. So I love that idea, Regina. United States in.
I know when Trump got elected, I all of a sudden introduced myself as Canadian whenever I went overseas. And to a greater picture, it's just because of how sad the path we've been on in this country has gotten over my lifetime. The last 40 years have not been good for this country. I mean, we've reached unbelievable wealth for 1 or 2% of the population, but we're controlled by a political system that does not represent, just in what's happened in recent time. We've got a Supreme Court that it basically represents 25% of the country, and they're now dictating that women don't have the right to choose their own, control their own health and bodies. I mean, it's just insane. And coming out of the last election, the one tool, the one weapon that we have is the right to vote. And we're seeing that being attacked on local level, state level, and even national level by the Republican Party. And so, I mean, we're not in a good place.
Well, and like you said, is this a new behavior, or does this seem to be this cycle that gets perpetuated even before the discovery of America? This has been European model, and before that, so where is this, that we have the potential to see a shift and a change when this is all our bodies have seen and known? And what there's a book I'm finally reading called My Grandmother's Hands that I had heard about for a long time, but it's helping me understand how much trauma actually motivates us to continue behaviors that are perpetuating harm, like the abusive relationship. That's all we know. If that's all we know, that's all we know. And we keep putting that forward. For many people, it creates that feeling of safety. So I tend to think, okay, what do we do to someone who's in a traumatic or a violent relationship, an abusive relationship? How do we tend to those? How can we help tend to one another so that we're not just saying, you shouldn't do that, or just change that, or just do this? That's not going to work. So what is, that's just something I tend to go to, is like, okay, we have this perpetuating cycle that's woven into our human experience, and what do we have that changes that? I don't want to shift just yet to full solution talking because we're not going to get there even at all, but even as we can try to get to some of that, but just to speak to whatever, what we're seeing, what's happening. I see the Steve Rose raising his hand. I'd love for you to jump in.
Yeah, I think the last slide had the word equality in it.
Equality or equity, yeah.
I think it was equality.
Okay.
So that it was like the Enlightenment had led to the concept of equality. And in your slide, it says equity. So I think like, it's kind of like in the collective mind, say like the collective American mind, their greatest achievement back then was they came up with a concept of equality. They're like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like we've strained our brains and this is the best we can do. But the problem with equality is, say, you know, everybody in the nation, say there was like a cash program to give an equal amount of money to everybody. So then the cash program says, okay, so we deal with equality. So everybody gets the same amount. You get $1, you get $1, you get $1. And for the rich people, they don't care because they don't need it. It's just a waste of time. But for people who actually need more help, that kind of equality is not effective. So equity is a better term, and that's a better kind of evolution to focus on, because equity would say, hey, how are you doing? What do you need? You know, we've got this dollar program. It's for some reason it's failing. But what do you need? Because we have this new concept of equity where we're going to actually find out what you actually need, who you actually are, and address it that way. So maybe you need like $100,000. You know, I mean, that's kind of crazy. I'm being exaggerated. But yeah, so I just saw that word equality in the last slide. That was like the greatest mental achievement of the Enlightenment. And it just falls short. So I think we need to make the evolution into how can we create systems that actually work on equity, which actually addresses the whole individual. Oh, and I had a question. What was your learn, unlearn? What was that thing?
Oh, learn. Yeah, learn, unlearn, relearn.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead, Tim.
I was just going to say, sadly, not much is going to change in this country until we tear down and rebuild the political system, because that's where we're stuck. Nothing changes. We're ruled by these older people, and I speak as the elder statesman in this group. We're ruled by these old white fucks. I told Mark I would try to use the F-bomb as little as possible. And until we challenge that power, and the only way that happens is through the vote, nothing's going to change. You know, I use the Vietnam War as kind of something to look at as when this country did affect some change, and that was all the communities coming together because of the draft system. It was picking on the poorer communities more than it was the rich community, because the rich kids got out of the draft. The poor kids didn't, and they were forced in the army, and those are the ones that were dying in Vietnam, and that forced all these communities to come together. And that's basically what's going to happen again, is we're going to have to all join ranks and go to battle against this establishment that has been ruling us since the birth of this country. Old, rich, white landowners. And that's what it was founded on, but nothing's really changed for the most part.
I really liked what Steve was saying earlier about how if I give everyone $1, everyone doesn't need $1. That does not represent equality. And it puts you in the mind of what happened with the whole Corona and the stimulus checks. They were giving out basically the same amount of money to everyone. And what effect did that actually have? You didn't give it to the people who needed it. If you're giving someone $5 who didn't need it and give someone $5,000 that does need it, it makes a bit of a difference. So I think at all times it matters the most that we had representation to say, this is what we need, and this is how we handle all these situations.
Yeah, thank you, Natasha. That's good. Royal was going to speak. Yeah, hi there, Royal. Is that?
Hey, sorry, everybody. I'm not really ready for a public appearance right now, but I appreciate being able to be part of the discussion. But I was thinking about the statement for I guess this meaning, freedom and equity for, and it was just a space. I was thinking about freedom and equity for the future. Like seriously, looking at the state of America right now and knowing that it's been like this since before I was born, long before my mother was born and my grandmother was born. And it might be like this when I die, when I'm dead and gone, and I have to pass this to my children. It is very upsetting. It's very upsetting to the point where I kind of, as a Black man in America, like, what am I doing? Like, why am I doing this? I should be at arms. I should be, nothing is okay right now. And I don't know, like, I'm trying to stay calm, and I was listening to you guys, but that's kind of just how I feel right now. That's where my mind has been at all this time. Where am I, what am I gonna, is this a society that I'm gonna leave behind for my children? Like for my son, I don't want him to grow up in America like this. I want him to grow up where it's fair and just for everybody, regardless of your skin. And I guess, like Mark said earlier, we kind of at the point where we had to bear arms and oppress, and go to the government and let them know our concerns and voice our concerns. It's gotten to the point now. It's been at this point, actually. We should have been storming the Capitol like they did on January 6th, but actually there's more people with more pressing issues than just the people that was on January 6th. It doesn't make sense to me. I'm sorry, like that's all I was thinking about.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you jumped in, and I mean, this is exactly what I would like to have here, is a conversation where we really talk about what we're feeling and how we're personally impacted, and allowing ourselves to release some of that frustration, because absolutely, it's almost pathetic that what we are seeing is history repeat itself, and we have an incredibly intelligent potential. As we know, with the human experience, we can love each other so deeply. We can have the most incredible compassion for one another. We can envision peace, but we just don't know how to make it happen when we start bringing in a lot of people and trying to run a country, let alone this whole globe. So I think,
sadly, like, I was looking at the census for America right now. It's 50% Caucasians, 15% African Americans, like 3% Asians or something. Basically, when it comes down to is the white people, no offense, that live in America have to do something about it. They're the main ones. It's really on you guys. We're not strong enough to really say what we want. We've been oppressed and we can't be heard. It's up to you to voice and say that we all need to be treated as equal. I know and I see how we're treated. Let's treat them the same way. It's really up to you. We can't do anything for you, you know?
I agree. It's like y'all keep asking us to fix problems that we didn't create. I didn't come here and put these rules in place, and I didn't design this political structure to ensure that the actual common man is not heard. Instead, we have to march, we have to fight, we have to scream and yell till our lungs bleed, saying that this is what we deserve, just to not even be like you. We don't want to be like you. We just want to be treated as we are.
Absolutely, 100%. Regina.
And speaking to that is like, I feel very frustrated, and I'm still don't know how I mean, I'm still working. I'm not saying I don't know. I'm still working on the fact that I do see a lot of white people who have the privilege of not being impacted if they don't vote. right? But then they espouse all this, like, the government needs to do this and this change needs to happen, but they're still not ensuring the vote and electing people into office, but locally, state and then of course federally. So that's, why I do feel like I have to, just kind of as royal, it's like, it is the white people's responsibility to be making that change. And, and as kind of an example that really kind of recently got me riled up was that it was mostly white men who were saying like Ruth Bader Ginsburg should have resigned. But, there was 100 million people who didn't vote, or a lot of, the white women who voted for Trump, but that ensured that Trump got elected over Hillary Clinton. Whether we absolutely like Hillary Clinton or not, we wouldn't be in this place, like with Roe v. Wade, if Hillary was elected. And I know a lot of white people who chose to stay out of the election. And we have, the implications through the Trump years because of that. And I feel like we as white people need to hold them accountable for that.
Well, let's remember that Hillary actually won the popular vote. So
but that's
Trump won because of the political system we have in place that is 250 years old and is completely out of date and makes no sense in this day and age. So I agree. The onus and the responsibility is on the white community. But for this to happen, it's going to take a coalition of all the communities coming together and probably forging a new party and taking control through the existing system so that we can then break it, tear it down and rebuild it.
And can I respond?
Sure.
To that? So one is, again, if people don't vote, we won't change the system. But two, founding member of the California Green Party, stood on the corners trying to create a third party system. And I don't know. I mean, like, not to say, I don't want to say that it won't work, but I don't want to say it won't work, but I think from what my experience was with the Green Party is we were still, the majority of the people, great ideas, great ideals, but still so stuck. They're so, how do I say it? They had so bought in, they weren't conscious of how they were still bought in on how the system works. And still, so they were trying to repeat the system to achieve, as opposed to really staying true to what their values were. So, I mean, that's the challenge because, the United States is such a massive country, but
well, and it's not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to happen easily. It's going to be a lot of painful work, but I mean, that's the only way I see out of it, other than just open warfare, civil war.
I think that what I'm feeling and sensing around this is there's a certain level of comfort that some people have the privilege to be able to be in, because a dominant culture says there's going to be things that are going to happen, but you won't be affected too badly if you're part of the dominant culture. But for those who are non-white or people who don't have as strong of a voice, they're always going to be a greater impact to those communities based on what's happening in government, politics, et cetera. But for those people who are comfortable enough, they don't really feel an impact of what happens. They can continue to live the way they live. They can continue to eat the way that they eat, but they're not feeling a real impact, then change doesn't seem to happen. But if you are walking down the street and you see somebody get mugged, beaten, thrown down, do you run to try to help? Do you call 911? Do you see what is possible? Or do you just say, well, someone else will take care of that? And then we keep going. And I think that's what's happened too much in our culture, is that we don't see that person being hurt as a brother and a sister, or see that person being hurt as a fellow human on this planet. We're just sticking with our comfortable space. But is that also because of our own trauma around other stuff that we just don't want to get involved? And so if people don't get involved, who have the privilege and the power because they're comfortable, that's why I don't see us making much progress. And I do agree, we all do have to come together. And I think it's people who can speak up, who don't have the power in our imbalanced world. If they can speak up, that maybe motivates the people who do have power to go, oh, I hear you. I'm inspired to do something about it. This is part of that breaking the ignorance, that I think we all have on some level, or if we can break through that and see, oh, I think I could make an impact, and that might help me feel like I'm making progress if I could do something like help that person who's being beaten instead of walking away. I want to read a little bit of what I see in the chat here, because there's just some good things that I don't think everybody's getting to read. So I'll try to go back. I see government that is supposed to represent us does not look like us. How is that fair or equal representation? Instead, they are mostly white old men attempting to change our progressive laws, return us back to where we once were, and we don't want to go back. We can't go back, as Anjali. Smith Royal, we don't want to go back. We need to go forward. We know that what's been wrong with society, let's fix it, acknowledge our mistakes, and make it better. And that's at the very least, part of that awareness component. The next component of that, I think, is the acceptance component. Accept that we messed up. Rules were made that maybe had some kind of relevance 200, 300, 1,000 years ago, but that we're still bringing them forward because we think they're so sacred and precious, when they actually are causing and perpetuating harm. So these sacred texts, political texts, or religious texts, we're holding to them so dearly, but is this part of what's causing these problems? And is there some way, some conversation there? Any thoughts, anybody?
I don't think it's necessarily the text that we're I think it's more the fear of losing. And once again, it kind of goes back to money and wealth. And that's why people are always hesitant to change, because they are afraid they're going to lose something. And I'm not quite sure how you overcome that, but it's, once again, I think it's just going to have to be, I've always said the true battle that's going to happen in this country is spirituality versus religion. And, and everybody is going to have to come up. Yeah, it's so hard. I mean, all of these are such big topics that you could spend days on each little aspect, because it's just, there's no easy way to go through them.
Agreed. And this felt like a daunting thing to create for us here to talk about, to have this discussion. And honestly, most of them are when we had, Pride Month last month talking about LGBTQ rights, AAPI the month before. I feel like there are these nice discrete topics that we can just sort of make an hour and 15 minutes about. But truly, these are big current issue topics, but I want us to think about, and we'll start to make that shift now. We talk about them. What can be done? That is, like Royal was saying, that we don't just keep seeing our children in our children's children, how can we see this as something that's maybe a future goal? It's kind of like, Regina, you were talking to me yesterday about Gavin Newsom and how some of his work in his short term was to actually think ahead, not to worry about, is he getting all the awards and the gains in his exact term limit, but to whatever he was doing in his term, it was thinking ahead. I'm going to set the stage. I'm going to create situations for us to progress on it from here. I don't know a lot about all of the things he did like that, but you were commenting on that, and I like that. That felt promising, rather than one person and their ego trying to get credit for the big change. He's part of this idea that it's a long-term vision, and I'm going to be part of it by starting this stage of it. I don't know if you have any other thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, I just got to see that from, being on the inside of government, and hearing him, talk to department heads and explaining why he was implementing certain policies or requiring departments to do things in his goals and his vision. So, and for those that were there, we were talking about this because, the idea of term limits, and I've seen the upside and definitely the downside of term limits. And so, and I see that sometimes the progressives, and mostly the progressives, and, from San Francisco, I'll just say, which is predominantly white male run, is, they kind of go to the other extreme, not really thinking of fully, I think sometimes, the full implications of that. Some of the things that I kind of think about, because it just feels like so overwhelming and so daunting, and, in terms of just the shifts of things that need to take place. Of course, a lot of it is, it has to take place in government. And I myself was a little ignorant until I really started working in government, how much it impacts your day-to-day life, right, as a citizen. So, and mostly not being aware of what that, of really what it is to the fullest extent. And definitely some of that's from the privilege of being a white person. But I think for myself, some of it is like, well, where is my community? And I'll just say community is like my city. Where is my city? What are things that are not, that need improvement? And so how can I work on that? Right? Kind of at the personal level. There were some questions you asked, and I mean, in one hand, I feel like because I was working so much in politics, that I kind of lost my spiritual self, right? And yoga kind of brings that reconnection back to the spiritual self. And so I need to re-nurture that so that I can be more loving to those that necessarily aren't fully on the same page as me. But, so I guess I'm just look at, like, there is a lot of work that can be done in San Francisco in and of itself to deal with equity, right? The Mayor Breed made sure that the city put in this office of racial equity, and their first charge was to really require all the departments analyze their racial impact through hiring, through policies. And even still, I could see, even, I'm now retired, but that some of the departments were really not going as far as they needed to go. We're not owning as much as they needed to own. And so know that work was still underway when I left, but that's still a first sort of step, but there still needs to be accountability for those departments not continuing, not to go as far as they need to go, or analyze its behavioral past so that things aren't repeated. So I guess what I'm just sort of saying is that at the local level, there's a lot of work in community. And also I've witnessed the power of community coming together, and who you elect. Because I don't think, Mayor Breed, if it was somebody else in place, would have created Office of Racial Equity, right? And so, and having been a person, who grew up in the housing projects within the city and really being able to see its racist behavior from a very personal lens. So I don't know where I am going with that. Those were some thoughts I just wanted to share.
Yeah, no, that's what it's all about, is sort of letting those thoughts streamline. I think the Steve Bros was going to say something.
Yeah, hearing a lot of good stuff. I think I was hearing like crisis needs to happen. And I think that the founding group for this country had the advantage of crisis. So they clearly identified a crisis, which was that their government was taking money from them and they needed to protect their money. The motivation for that crisis is shallow to me, but I see how it plays into human nature to want to preserve self. But that's kind of, I think I was seeing what we need is a well-defined crisis. And to like you were saying with Gavin Newsom, to think ahead. And if we create a crisis through violence, we're not really changing. Even if we make a change, we're not changing, because that's how humans have always taken dominance through violence. So if we can come up with a crisis, and then I was also hearing from Tim, spiritual versus religious crisis. I think if we can possibly make it like a spiritual crisis, we can maybe be a little more gentle about how we want to possibly form a new system. Because if we keep working off of the 250-year-old document, we're not going to get anywhere, because that's currently the part of the problem with the Supreme Court.
Right.
Is the federal government, the person in power, exerted his power using the old document. So there needs to be a clear, compassionate, spiritual crisis, but at the same time, people's emotions need to be felt. Anger, injustice, but just as long as it doesn't result in violence. Now, it probably will, and it kind of has. But if we can foresee that a crisis of violence could happen, and consider that in our next steps to form a new system, I think that'll be really important.
Sadly, I'm going to say just sadly, we've gotten to the point where violence is kind of looking like it's the only answer. What has being nonviolent gotten us up into this point for the past 400 plus years, or however so many years? What has being nonviolent gotten us? It hasn't really gotten us anywhere. It's getting to the tipping point where it's going to have to be, America is in for a violent revolution, and it's going to be broadcasting all across the world stage because of social media. And then the world is going to see how America has destroyed itself.
Mhm.
That's the only thing that I think is going to come down to, because nothing has been working before.
It's certainly the most dominant way that I think change has happened in a historical context is through war, through violence and harm. And it does sometimes seem like our most common denominator amongst human beings is to use some kind of violence or harm to get someone to notice. And that makes me sad that isn't there, is that going to actually change, or do we just keep creating more of this momentum of that kind of psychology, that change happens by war, change happens through violence, change happens, and I don't know. I wish that there would be a stop in that equation. I want to read here what Anjali wrote to sort of start to shift our conversation in this direction a little bit. Because as we said, this is a big conversation, so I don't want to minimize any of these topics, but I want to make sure to include a certain amount in this conversation. So if we want to continue any of those directions, absolutely, but I just want to make sure to include this. And Anjali was saying, Regina mentioning yoga makes me think of, can yoga be used as a tool for creating and furthering that connection from one person to another, regardless of culture? And I'd love to hear more, Anjali, if you wanted to add anything additional to that. Otherwise, of course, I will, but I'd love to hear.
Let me think what I want to add to that. Go ahead, add your pulse.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Glenn, just appreciate you bringing that up. So in my journey at this point, thinking about how can I contribute? I see so many things in the world that break my heart over and over, that continue to make it seem that we're not making enough progress in this material world. And what I started to learn was that there was a conversation happening in a different realm of the body-mind system, which was accepting the fact that we are limited inside of this physical form that is built and woven with all of these traumas, this history that is focused on the survival range of our being, but we have access to be able to imagine something different. And there have been movements, whether it was Martin Luther King or Gandhi, where definitely there was a lot of violence, but there was also a different energy that went into those approaches that made people reflect and consider different ways of seeing the world. And if we can find a practice, something that we can all do for ourselves first, that allows us to get in contact with where we feel the personal harm, we can unwind that personal harm and then become empowered through that personal transformation to then be able to vocalize and move forward and use that as our weapon, so to speak, to inspire others to change and to awaken and to reflect. I think if I go in and try to inspire someone with a gun, it's going to at some point want them to find a gun or to find something bigger. If I go in and try to inspire someone to find their inner truth or to awaken their deeper sense of compassion for one another, maybe that will have a ripple effect. And truly, that's why I left my event world and I left the work that I was doing when that became an epiphany. And I thought, will I be able to survive in this world if I make this shift and create a different pathway for myself and try to inspire through a different way of action? And then what can others do? Okay, tag, someone else is it. Let's see, the Steve Rose and then Regina. And then
when I was saying about a spiritual crisis of compassion to make change would be, a good way to go about changing the country. There's like Royal said, and Tim has alluded to, I mean, if drastic change does happen in our system, violence is going to be one of the things, because there's as many different ways to make change as there are people and groups. So violence could be part of it. But what I'd like to focus on is kind of the spiritual versus kind of the religious war that Tim was kind of bringing up, and maybe focus on spiritual to be encompassing to, you know, all the religions and spiritual things, kind of like integral yoga. But what was I going to say? Oh man, I lost it. Yeah.
Yeah, no problem.
Oh, and I was gonna propose. Do we want to? Would it be fair to vote to extend this to 2:30, or would that be an unfair proposal?
No, it's certainly a fair proposal, and I know for myself, I will have to end it at 2:15 because I have clients after this. But I don't want the conversation to end. And so one of the things I'll do is, you know, this will get posted, and I'll have this in my newsletters, and there could be a way to think about what would be action steps that can come of this, for sure. As it is, we only have about 4 minutes left. So I want to give Regina a chance, and then if anybody else wanted to
like 5 seconds, I wanted to say, when you do your talks at the beginning of the yoga classes, I was just thinking today, those should be recorded and made available.
All right, thank you, I appreciate that. Okay,
I'll be very quick. So this just, engineer just made me think, the thing about the yoga for me, and I like doing class in person with other people, is because I love the energy of being with other people, right? And that energy of working, it's accepting, we're in our own space, but we're together, you know, working on whatever we're working on in with our bodies, our loving our bodies, changing our bodies for the health. And so that collective energy is what, you know, I feel like is maybe part of that spiritual thing of taking, because then when I leave, I just feel more open to than people outside and things of that sort. So anyway, just
yeah, well, yeah, absolutely.
Engineer, you made me.
I figured out what I wanted to say.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so it's kind of like the war of the bondage of self, kind of from the 12-step programs. They bring up the bondage of self.
Yeah.
So we've all got different layers and types of bondages of self. And if we can find ways to combat or work with bondage of self compassionately with each other, you know, I think that, again, kind of the spiritual solution is where I would be headed.
Awesome. Anybody else? Last thoughts?
I'm gonna share one last.
Yes. Yay.
I think, like with the pandemic and everything, like with the news, it feels like it's debilitating when I feel like, oh, I'm powerless, or I think about race. So I kind of have like this internal conflict of myself where, you know, I'm accepting the history of being Black and Japanese, but I also don't want to walk into a room thinking about it, because then I feel super powerless. I was listening to a podcast of how we think we're so polarized, but I think it's just because polarized opinions get so much attention on Twitter and social media. I think most Americans are actually in the middle. Like someone said, like we say there's a red and blue, but it's actually a purple. And the thought of everything being polarized makes me feel a little bit powerless, like I can't do anything. So I think most of us are more in the middle. And for me, that's way more empowering than thinking I'm powerless or like nothing is going to change. So yeah. And I think yoga helps with that too.
Excellent.
Yeah.
That's an awesome contribution, and I think a nice way to start to round out the conversation as we start to move towards a close here. I want to also offer the resource that Anjali has put in here, white privilege unpacking the invisible backpack. So by Peggy McIntosh. And then also I offered My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts. That's by Resma Menachem. And there's a lot of information out there that I think continues to help us dispel some of that ignorance or some of that inertia, or even that over comfort that we can get into where we really dislike being uncomfortable. But this is at a point where we all have to recognize if you're not uncomfortable, then we're not in the movement. If you're not uncomfortable, then you're either your nervous system isn't prepared and you need to do work that strengthens you or awakens you. This is definitely a tipping point, and I know this is one of a very small but hopefully powerful conversation that I hope will continue. Certainly there are lots of other conversations and ways we can think about how do we keep this going. Especially Royal, I really appreciate you being here and sharing where you are right here in this moment, and understanding that your frustration, I started to feel it too, and it was you deserve to be able to have your voice heard, and for people to consider what the heck can be done. So I hope that you, I don't know, hang in there with us, and that we all think about this as a group. I love this idea to leave again, that our framing of this can be that, rather than, oh no, we'll never come up with a solution, to, hey, we're already working on a solution. Let's keep going. All right, thanks everyone for being here. A special thanks again for the people who were brave to step forward and talk today. Also to thank Anjali and Rachel and Natasha and Regina and Tim, and then all the guests here with on Instagram Live and also here in the studio and at home. So thanks everyone. Let's take a moment, just a moment in silence.
What was the book that you mentioned? I'm sorry.
My Grandmother's Hands.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. We can just all close our eyes for the last few moments here. Whatever you're, however you're sitting, find a way to be a little bit more comfortable with the body, and get in touch with your own breath. Just notice the quality of the breath. Imagine that your inhale creates that uplifted, lengthened torso. The exhale reminds you not to strain, helps you feel a sense of grounding and connecting downwards. It allows you to feel that you are on your perfect spot. Nobody else is taking up that spot on this planet. We'll take a few more moments to be in silence. And then I'll finish, I'll have us complete this with an Om. Om. And gently open your eyes, look around your space, relocate yourself to the here and now. All right, let's stay connected. Thank you so much again, everyone. Thanks everyone Instagram Live here in the space. And we'll see you next month. The topic will be around wellness for August Empower Hour. So I'll see you then. All right, thank you. Yeah. Okay, bye everyone on Zoom.